The hidden visit. The night air over San Jose carried a quiet chill, the kind of stillness that only arrived after the city had surrendered to sleep. On a narrow street not far from the glass towers of Silicon Valley, a small restaurant glowed with soft amber light. It wasn't the largest or the fanciest place, but it had something that drew people in: warmth, sincerity, and a menu that felt like home. Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, had built it years ago not as a business project, but as a reminder of his humble beginnings, a place that could employ people who were struggling to find their path. What most people didn't know was that Sundar visited the restaurant in disguise, quietly slipping in at night, not as a billionaire or a global figure, but as an ordinary man who wanted to see if kindness still lived in the everyday details. That evening, he wore a plain gray jacket, faded jeans, and glasses that made him look nothing like the polished leader the world saw on television. His driver waited at a distance as Sundar walked through the side door, blending into the late-night crowd of dishwashers and waiters finishing their shifts. He didn't announce himself. He never did. He believed the truth of a place showed only when people thought no one important was watching. As he entered, the sound of clinking plates and muffled laughter greeted him. The cooks in the kitchen spoke in rapid bursts of Spanish and Hindi, calling out orders and teasing one another about who had spilled sauce on their apron. Sundar smiled softly, remembering his own first job as a young man when he had carried trays in a tiny cafeteria. Every detail of this place reminded him why he kept it alive. Not for profit, but for people. But that night, something was different. In the far corner of the dining area, he noticed a young woman in a server's uniform sitting at a table, her shoulders trembling as she tried to hide her tears. She kept her head low, wiping her eyes with the edge of her sleeve, unaware that anyone was watching. Sundar felt a sudden heaviness in his chest. He had seen employees stressed before: long hours, difficult customers, the endless fight to make ends meet. But this was not ordinary. There was something broken in the way she held herself, as if the world had dropped its full weight on her all at once. Her name tag read Mira. Sundar had heard of her before, a bright student who had joined part-time while pursuing her studies, praised for her kindness and hard work. But now she looked fragile, as though her spirit had cracked. He paused, unsure if he should approach. Revealing himself was never his plan. The entire purpose of his secret visits was to observe, not interfere. Yet his heart refused to let him walk away. He sat quietly at a nearby table, waiting, watching, giving her space to breathe. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the room. One of the senior staff, a manager named Rakesh, barked at her from the counter. "Mira, you can't just sit around crying. Customers don't care about your problems. Get up and get back to work." His words carried more irritation than compassion, and Sundar noticed how the other staff looked away, pretending not to hear. Mira tried to rise, forcing a weak smile, but her knees wobbled and she sank back into the chair. Sundar felt his pulse quicken. Every instinct told him to step forward, to stop the harshness, but he held himself back. The story wasn't clear yet, and sometimes rushing in too soon meant missing the truth. Instead, he listened. Mira whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, I just got a call. My father, he collapsed tonight. I don't know if he's going to be okay. I can't leave because I need this job. I can't lose the income." The room fell silent. Even the clattering of dishes seemed to pause. Rakesh stiffened, caught off guard by her words, but instead of offering comfort, he muttered something about personal problems not belonging at work, and walked away. Sundar's hands curled into fists under the table. He thought of his own father, who had sacrificed so much for him back in India, who had worked long nights without complaint just so his son could study. Sundar knew that kind of love, and he knew the fear of possibly losing it. His disguise suddenly felt heavy, almost suffocating. Here he was, one of the most powerful men in the world, sitting a few feet away while one of his own employees carried pain no one else seemed willing to notice. And yet, if he revealed himself too soon, he risked changing the natural course of what would unfold. He decided to wait just a moment longer to see if anyone else would step in, if compassion still lived in the hearts around her. A dishwasher, a boy barely 20, quietly walked over and placed a glass of water in front of Mira. He didn't say much, only whispered, "Stay strong, Didi. It will be okay." Sundar's eyes softened at the gesture. Kindness was still here, even if it was small. But small kindness in the face of great pain often felt like a drop of rain in a desert. As Mira sipped the water, her phone buzzed again. She answered quickly, her hands shaking, and within seconds, her face turned pale. "The doctors say they need immediate payment for surgery," she said under her breath. Almost to herself, "If I don't send it tonight, they won't begin the treatment." A silence heavier than stone filled Sundar's chest. In that instant, he knew this was not just about one young woman's struggle. This was about the very values he claimed to live by: respect, humility, resilience, kindness. What good was all his success, his billions, if he could not reach out in this moment? The disguise no longer mattered. But just as he prepared to rise, to reveal himself and step into the story that fate had placed in front of him, a group of late-night customers walked in, loud and careless, demanding service. Mira quickly wiped her eyes and tried to stand, but her legs buckled, and the tray she carried slipped from her hands, shattering against the floor. The sound echoed through the restaurant like a gunshot. Everyone froze. Mira fell to her knees, tears spilling freely now, broken glass glistening around her. Sundar's breath caught in his throat. This was the moment. The question was, would he remain hidden in the shadows, or would he finally step forward and change everything? And as the room stared at the broken pieces on the floor, Sundar slowly pushed back his chair. The unspoken truth. The sharp crack of the broken tray lingered in the air as if time itself had frozen. Every pair of eyes in the restaurant locked onto the trembling figure on the floor. Mira tried to gather the scattered pieces with shaky hands, her tears falling soundlessly onto the shards, mixing with tiny drops of spilled juice that reflected the light like shattered stars. No one moved at first. Some of the customers exchanged impatient glances. Others whispered under their breath, annoyed at the sudden delay in their service. The manager, Rakesh, stormed out from behind the counter with a scowl etched on his face, his heavy steps striking the floor like the ticking of a countdown clock. "What is this, Mira?" he snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut through the silence. "First you sit around crying, and now this? Are you trying to ruin the night for everyone?" His voice carried across the room, filled with authority but empty of compassion. Mira lowered her head further, whispering an apology so soft it was barely a sound. Sundar, still seated a few tables away in his disguise, felt the words pierce through him. Every part of him wanted to intervene, but he kept watching, knowing that real character revealed itself not through staged moments, but through how people behaved when no one powerful was watching. One of the customers, a middle-aged man in a business suit, banged his hand on the table. "Can we get some service here, or are we supposed to wait all night?" His voice carried irritation, but behind it, there was a smugness, like he enjoyed seeing someone else falter. Sundar turned his gaze toward him and observed quietly. The man looked familiar, perhaps one of the many executives who frequented the place without ever knowing its true owner. Mira forced herself to stand, even though her knees wobbled like thin branches in a storm. She grabbed another tray from the counter, her fingers trembling, and hurried toward the impatient table as she approached. The businessman gave her a cold look and muttered just loud enough for his friends to hear. "Maybe they should hire people who can actually handle work." The group chuckled cruelly, unaware that the man quietly sitting nearby was the very person who signed the paychecks of the entire chain. Sundar's jaw tightened. He had built this restaurant to give people chances, not to become a stage for humiliation. But something inside told him that this moment wasn't about punishing anyone yet. It was about understanding the depth of what Mira was going through. He watched as she tried to take their order, her voice steadying as she repeated the specials, forcing a polite smile. But when she turned to leave, the businessman suddenly stuck his foot out, barely noticeable to anyone else, and the tray tilted dangerously. With remarkable reflex, she caught it before it hit the floor, her face flushing with embarrassment as the table burst into mocking laughter. Sundar's hands gripped the edge of his seat. This wasn't just stress anymore. It was cruelty, and cruelty, when witnessed, demanded a response. Behind the counter, the young dishwasher who had earlier offered her water whispered to another cook. She hasn't had her break yet. She's been working since morning." Sundar caught the words, and a deeper picture started to form in his mind. Mira wasn't just emotional because of her father's health. She was exhausted, stretched beyond her limits, and carrying burdens that no one had bothered to see. As the night wore on, the restaurant began to settle into its usual rhythm again. But Sundar remained seated, quietly observing every detail. He noticed how Mira moved through the tables like a ghost, always polite, always smiling, but behind her eyes was a storm. She checked her phone between tasks, hoping for good news. But each time she slipped it back into her apron, her face grew a little paler. Toward the end of the night, as customers began to leave and the staff started cleaning up, Mira stepped outside to take a call. Sundar, careful not to draw attention, followed a few steps behind and stood near the side wall just within earshot. Her voice cracked as she spoke into the phone. "Please, doctor, I'm trying. I promise I'll find a way. Don't let him wait. Please start the surgery. I'll send something tonight." Her words carried desperation, not because she lacked strength, but because the world had cornered her into a place where strength alone was not enough. After the call, she sat on the steps outside, burying her face in her hands. Sundar took a slow breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. This was no longer about a simple act of kindness. This was about a life that might be slipping away while the world remained too busy to care. Suddenly, a car pulled up, its headlights washing over the pavement. A man in a leather jacket stepped out, his face hard, his movements sharp. He approached Mira quickly, his voice low but intense. "Where is the money?" he demanded. She flinched at his tone. "You said you'd pay me back by today. Do you think I'm running a charity?" Sundar's eyes narrowed. This was unexpected. Mira stood backing away slightly. "I told you I'd give it to you by the end of this week." "Please, just a few more days." "My father? I don't care about your father," the man interrupted coldly. "You borrowed from me. If you don't pay, things will get complicated." He leaned closer, his voice like poison. "Very complicated." Sundar's heart pounded. He had come here to quietly observe his restaurant, but now he was standing in the shadows, watching one of his employees being threatened outside her workplace. The moment stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap at any second. He took one step forward, then another. For the first time that night, he was no longer just a hidden observer. He was about to step into her world fully, and nothing after this moment would be the same. As the man tightened his grip on Mira's arm, Sundar's voice finally broke the silence. "Leave her alone." The man turned, surprised to see a calm stranger standing there. He had no idea who Sundar really was. The moment of courage, the man's hand froze mid-air as Sundar's quiet but firm voice cut through the tension like a blade. The dim streetlight cast long shadows across the pavement, giving the small alley behind the restaurant a heavy stillness. Mira's eyes widened in shock when she saw the stranger stepping closer. For a split second, fear and confusion crossed her face. She didn't know who he was, but something in his calm eyes told her he wasn't just another passerby. The man in the leather jacket turned slowly, sizing Sundar up with a cold sneer. "This isn't your business," he said, his tone laced with arrogance. He had the kind of swagger that came from believing no one would challenge him, especially not someone who looked as ordinary as Sundar did in his plain jacket and glasses. But Sundar didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, his steps deliberate. "When someone threatens a woman outside her workplace," he replied softly, "it becomes everyone's business." His words didn't carry the weight of volume, but of authority, quiet, unwavering, like the deep current beneath still water. The man chuckled mockingly, stepping closer until he was only a breath away. "You have no idea who you're talking to," he hissed. "Walk away, old man, before you regret it." Mira stood frozen between them, torn between panic and disbelief. She tried to intervene, whispering hurriedly, "Please, don't make this worse. He's serious." But Sundar didn't move. Years of leading the world's most influential company had taught him many things: how to remain calm in chaos, how to read people's intentions, and most importantly, how to protect others without letting ego take over. He tilted his head slightly, observing the man's stance, his aggressive posturing, the way his eyes darted nervously when challenged. Beneath the tough exterior, there was insecurity, the kind that relied on fear to stay in control. Sundar took one more step forward and said, "Let go of her arm." The man tightened his grip for a brief second, testing the stranger's resolve. But then something in Sundar's eyes made him hesitate. A quiet strength that didn't belong to someone easily intimidated. Reluctantly, he released her. Mira stumbled back, clutching her arm, breathing hard. The man glared at Sundar, then at her. "This isn't over," he spat. "You have until Friday. If I don't get my money, you'll wish this night never happened." He turned abruptly and walked to his car, slamming the door before speeding away, the sound of tires echoing into the night. When the car disappeared around the corner, silence returned heavier than before. Mira stood on the steps, her hands trembling, her breath shaky. She stared at Sundar as if trying to figure out why a stranger would involve himself in something so dangerous. "Why did you do that?" she finally whispered. "You don't even know me." Sundar took a slow breath, his voice gentle but firm. "Because sometimes doing nothing is worse than doing something imperfect," he said. "You didn't deserve to face that alone." His words struck something deep inside her, something she had tried to bury under layers of exhaustion and fear. For the first time that night, her tears were not from helplessness, but from the shock of someone simply standing beside her. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice almost breaking. "But you should go. This isn't your problem. I can handle it." Sundar looked at her quietly, reading the weight behind her words. He could see the walls she had built around herself. The way people who suffer too much too often start to believe that asking for help is a weakness. He wanted to tell her who he was, to assure her that she wasn't alone, but he held back. Revealing his identity now might make her uncomfortable or shift the dynamic in a way that wasn't honest. Instead, he chose to be exactly who he was in that moment, a stranger who cared. "Handling everything alone doesn't make you strong," he said softly. "Sometimes real strength is allowing someone to stand with you." She looked away, unsure how to respond. The truth in his words unsettled her because it touched the very part of her that was tired of pretending to be unbreakable. They stood there for a moment, the night wrapping around them like a quiet cocoon. Finally, Mira spoke, her voice low. "He lent me money when I didn't have any other option," she admitted. "I needed to pay for my father's medicine months ago. I thought I could return it quickly, but things kept getting worse. Now my father's in the hospital and they need surgery money immediately. I have nothing left, and I can't lose this job either." Sundar listened intently, each word painting a clearer picture of her struggle. He had heard countless business pitches and presentations, but nothing compared to the raw honesty of someone fighting for someone they loved. His heart ached at the thought of a young woman carrying such a heavy burden while the world watched in silence. "How much do they need for the surgery?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, uncertain if she could trust him with that detail. But something in his tone, something steady and sincere, pushed her to answer. 2.5 lakh, she whispered. "They said if I don't deposit it by tomorrow morning, they might delay the operation." "I don't know what to do anymore," Sundar's chest tightened. The amount wasn't large for him, but he knew it was everything for her. He also knew that stepping in impulsively with money might overwhelm or offend her pride. This needed to be handled carefully, with respect, not pity. He decided to keep his identity hidden a little longer and approach it through the proper channel. But one thing was certain in his heart. He wouldn't let her fight this alone anymore. Just then, the back door of the restaurant swung open, and Rakesh's voice echoed through the alley. "Mira, stop wasting time. Clean up inside before you leave." His tone was sharp, unaware of the storm that had just unfolded outside. Mira straightened quickly, wiping her face, hiding every trace of what had just happened. Sundar observed quietly as she stepped back into the fluorescent lights, slipping on the mask she wore every day. He remained in the shadows for a moment longer, watching her disappear back into the kitchen. Something inside him shifted that night. This was no longer just a quiet visit to observe his restaurant. This was now a mission of humanity. He had seen too much to walk away. As he turned to follow her inside, his phone vibrated softly in his pocket. It was a message from his assistant, reminding him of an important board meeting in the morning. But Sundar's mind was no longer in boardrooms or spreadsheets. His focus had narrowed to a single question: how to help without breaking her dignity. And as the restaurant lights dimmed for closing, Sundar's resolve grew stronger. Tomorrow would not be like today. Tomorrow, everything would begin to change. The quiet plant. The following morning, the sun rose over the city with a softness that masked the storms unfolding in quiet corners. Inside his home, Sundar sat at the edge of a simple wooden table, a cup of tea slowly cooling in his hands. His mind wasn't on the stack of emails or the upcoming board meeting that his assistant had mentioned last night. Instead, his thoughts were fixed on Mira's tear-stained face, her trembling voice, and the quiet strength she tried so hard to hold on to. He had witnessed countless business crises in his life, but something about this felt deeper, more human, and more urgent. This wasn't about fixing a financial problem. It was about protecting someone's dignity while extending a lifeline. As he stared out of the window at the soft morning light, he recalled the years when his own family had struggled. He remembered his father cycling for miles to work every day, his mother stretching every rupee to ensure their children could study, the sacrifices made quietly without complaint. Back then, even a small act of kindness from a stranger had felt like a miracle. Sundar understood what it meant to stand on the edge between hope and despair. And now, sitting in the position of someone who could change lives with a single decision, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his chest. He opened his laptop and quietly accessed the restaurant's employee records. Mira's file appeared. A part-time worker, consistent attendance, high customer ratings, and several notes from supervisors praising her attitude. But there were no complaints, no negative remarks, nothing to suggest carelessness or weakness. What he saw was a young woman doing everything right, yet still caught in the relentless grip of life's cruelty. Sundar leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He couldn't simply hand her the money outright. He knew from experience that sudden generosity, especially from someone in power, could feel like charity, and charity could sometimes wound pride more than poverty. He needed to create a way to help her without making her feel small. Later that day, Sundar arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual, still in disguise, blending into the background like any regular patron. He chose a corner seat where he could observe without drawing attention. The lunch rush had not yet begun, and the staff was preparing for the day. Mira moved through the restaurant with quiet focus, her face pale but determined, as if she had buried last night's fear under layers of duty. Sundar noticed how she greeted customers with a gentle smile, even though her eyes carried exhaustion. There was a resilience in her that reminded him of countless unsung heroes who kept moving forward even when the world didn't notice. Rakesh, the manager, walked through the floor with his usual briskness, barking instructions without much warmth. Sundar watched closely, noting the subtle power dynamics at play. He had always believed that the true culture of any workplace revealed itself not in policy documents, but in how the weakest were treated when no one important was watching. And here, in this small restaurant, he saw both cruelty and kindness existing side by side. As Mira walked past his table to deliver an order, Sundar gently called out, "Excuse me." She turned, slightly startled to see him, perhaps recognizing him as the stranger from last night. There was a flicker of gratitude in her eyes, but also caution. "Yes, sir?" she asked softly. Sundar offered a kind smile. "I was here last night," he said. "You handled everything with strength. Not everyone could have done that." Her cheeks flushed faintly. "I was just doing my job," she replied quickly, uncomfortable with praise. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Sometimes doing your job requires more courage than anyone can see." His words lingered in the air, and for the first time that morning, she allowed a small, genuine smile to surface. It was fleeting, but it was real. Sundar knew what he needed to do. After finishing his meal, he quietly made his way to the back office where Rakesh was reviewing invoices. "Can I have a word?" Sundar asked in a neutral tone. Rakesh looked up, slightly annoyed. "Who are you?" he asked bluntly. Sundar kept his expression calm. "Someone who cares about how this place runs," he replied. There was a quiet authority in his voice that made Rakesh unconsciously straighten in his chair. Sundar continued, "I want to propose something. I've noticed one of your servers, Mira. She works hard, Has she ever been considered for any form of advancement or scholarship? Rakesh frowned, clearly not expecting such a question. She's good at her work, sure, he said, but this is just a restaurant. We don't have scholarships. Besides, promotions take time. Sundar's eyes narrowed slightly. What if there was a program for employees who show exceptional dedication? Something like an emergency grant or support fund for staff in crisis? Would you recommend her? Rakesh hesitated, sensing this stranger wasn't making idle conversation, if such a thing existed. I suppose yes, he muttered. Sundar nodded thoughtfully. Good, because I believe every workplace should care for its people when they're struggling. Maybe it's time your restaurant starts something like that. He turned to leave, leaving Rakesh confused and unsettled. He didn't know that the very man he had brushed off as a stranger was actually the owner with the power to change everything overnight. Later that afternoon, Sundar stepped into a quiet corner and made a series of discreet calls. He instructed his finance team to set up an employee emergency assistance program under the restaurant's name, starting immediately, and to process a grant in Mira's name as the first recipient. The amount matched exactly what she needed for her father's surgery. It would be given not as charity, but as official support, something that recognized her contribution rather than her misfortune. As the sun began to set, casting warm light across the restaurant's windows, Mira received a message from the office. She walked to the back hesitantly, unsure what to expect. Rakesh handed her a sealed envelope with a puzzled look. Apparently someone approved you for a special employee grant, he said. I didn't even know we had this. Lucky you! His tone was indifferent, but her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter explaining that due to her outstanding service and commitment, she had been selected for emergency support. The amount covered her father's surgery in full. Her knees nearly gave way as she read the letter again and again, unable to believe it. Tears welled up, but this time they weren't from fear. They were from the overwhelming relief of knowing her father's life could be saved. She pressed the letter to her chest, whispering a silent thank you to whoever had made this happen. Across the room, Sundar watched quietly from his corner, his disguise still intact. He didn't need her to know it was him. This wasn't about recognition. It was about doing what was right without needing applause. But deep inside, a warmth spread through him that no corporate achievement had ever given. As she rushed outside to call the hospital, her face glowing with renewed hope, Sundar stood slowly and prepared to leave unnoticed. But just as he reached the door, he saw the same man in the leather jacket standing across the street, watching the restaurant with narrowed eyes. His presence was a reminder that some problems didn't disappear easily. The battle wasn't over yet. Shadows returned, night descended slowly, wrapping the city in a quiet stillness that seemed to hold its breath. Inside the restaurant, the dinner crowd was thinning, the clatter of dishes fading into the soft hum of closing routines. Mira moved with a lightness that hadn't been there before. Her father's surgery was scheduled for the next morning, and the hospital had confirmed receipt of the funds. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to feel a sense of relief that didn't feel fragile. She kept touching the folded letter in her apron pocket, as if afraid it might disappear if she let go. Little did she know that across the street the man in the leather jacket had returned, watching from the shadows with eyes that held both suspicion and resentment. Sundar sat at a quiet corner table again, his disguise intact, blending with the soft light and shadows of the restaurant. His mind wasn't at ease. Something about the man's lingering presence outside stirred his instincts. He had dealt with people like that before, those who thrived on intimidation, who fed on fear to keep control. Sundar knew that money alone might not solve everything. Sometimes help attracted unwanted attention, and sometimes the act of kindness stirred new conflicts. He watched carefully as Mira moved through her closing duties, unaware of the storm quietly forming outside. As the last customer left and the door locked behind them, Mira began wiping the tables with a gentle hum, a tune from her childhood slipping out unconsciously. The sound was soft, almost fragile, yet it carried something beautiful. Hope. Sundar found himself smiling faintly, but the moment was shattered when the front door suddenly rattled violently. Everyone turned toward it. The man in the leather jacket stood there, pounding his fist against the glass, his expression dark and impatient. Rakesh, irritated by the disturbance, marched to the door. "We're closed," he shouted through the glass. "Come back tomorrow." The man leaned closer, his voice muffled but threatening. "I need to talk to her, now!" Mira froze, the rag slipping from her hand. Her heart began to pound as memories of the previous night rushed back. She took a step back instinctively. Rakesh frowned and turned to her. "You know this guy?" Before she could answer, Sundar stood up. His movements were calm but purposeful, drawing everyone's attention without raising his voice. "Let him in," he said evenly. Rakesh hesitated, surprised that this quiet stranger would intervene again, but something in Sundar's tone made him obey without question. The man entered slowly, his boots echoing against the floor. The room seemed to shrink around him. "So," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery, "you suddenly have money, huh? Interesting timing." His eyes narrowed at Mira. "Who gave it to you?" She took a shaky breath. "It's from the restaurant, an employee support grant. I didn't borrow it from anyone else," he laughed, a low, cynical sound. "Support grant? You really think I'm stupid? No one just gives away that kind of money without a reason. Someone's helping you." His gaze shifted sharply toward Sundar, as if sensing something beneath the surface. "Maybe it's this guy." Mira quickly shook her head. "No, he's just a customer." The man stepped closer, his voice dropping lower. "You think you can just pay me later when you feel like it? I'm not a bank. If you suddenly have money for surgery, then you have money for me. I want my share now." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. Rakesh muttered something about calling security, but Sundar raised his hand slightly, stopping him. This wasn't a situation that brute force could solve cleanly. This was about power, intimidation, and fear, and Sundar understood those dynamics all too well. He stepped forward slowly, positioning himself between the man and Mira, his calm presence like a quiet wall. "You'll get your money on Friday, like she said," Sundar said softly. "But tonight you'll leave," the man sneered. "Who are you to tell me what to do?" he hissed. "Someone who won't let you hurt her," Sundar replied without hesitation. A tense silence followed. The man wasn't expecting such a measured response. Bullies often relied on chaos and panic, but Sundar's stillness disarmed him. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "You're making a mistake," the man warned. "You have no idea who I'm connected to." "Maybe," Sundar said, his eyes steady, "but I know what happens when people like you cross a line in the wrong place. And tonight you've reached that line." The man's bravado faltered for a second, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. He stepped back, muttering under his breath, then turned sharply toward the door. "Friday!" he spat before leaving. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing like a closing threat. Mira collapsed onto a chair, her hands trembling. The staff crowded around her, offering water and soft words. Rakesh shook his head. "He's trouble." "We should call the police," Mira whispered. "Please don't." "If he gets angrier, things might get worse." Her voice cracked with fear. Sundar looked at her, realizing just how deeply this man's control had seeped into her life. Fear had become a quiet cage around her. Later that night, as the restaurant emptied, Sundar remained behind. Mira approached him hesitantly, her eyes searching his face. "Why do you keep helping me?" she asked softly. "You don't even know me." Sundar paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because when I look at you, I see someone who's been fighting alone for too long," he said gently. "And sometimes life changes when just one person refuses to stay silent." She lowered her gaze, emotions swirling in her chest, gratitude, confusion, fear, hope. "You talk like someone who's seen a lot," she whispered. "Maybe I have," he replied with a faint smile. "And maybe it's time someone else saw you the way you deserve to be seen." As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed. It was the hospital. Her face went pale as she listened. "There's a complication," she whispered shakily. "They need me to come immediately." Sundar stood without a word. "I'll take you," he said simply. The night wasn't over, and as they stepped out into the darkness, the city lights flickering like distant stars, Sundar felt that this moment, this quiet decision to walk beside her, was about to change more than either of them could imagine. The unexpected truth. The hospital corridors were silent except for the soft hum of machines and the echo of hurried footsteps. The fluorescent lights cast a pale glow on the polished floors, reflecting the weight of countless stories unfolding in rooms behind closed doors. Mira walked quickly, her hands gripping the strap of her bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her face carried both fear and hope, like a storm struggling to clear the sky. Sundar followed beside her, calm and steady, the quiet presence she didn't know she needed. Neither spoke as they approached the surgical wing, where a nurse met them with a serious expression. "The doctor needs to speak to you immediately," the nurse said softly. Mira's stomach twisted. She nodded and hurried toward the consultation room, Sundar just a step behind. Inside, the doctor, an older man with tired eyes, greeted them. "There was a complication," he explained gently. "The surgery is still possible, but your father's condition has become critical. We need to make some quick decisions." His tone was professional but carried an undertone of urgency. Mira's breath caught in her throat. "Please," she whispered, "do whatever it takes." "I've already arranged the funds. Just save him," the doctor nodded. "We'll proceed immediately. But be prepared. It's going to be a long night." As they wheeled her father toward the operating room, Mira caught a brief glimpse of his face through the window. The man who had raised her with gentle hands and quiet strength now lay pale and still under harsh lights. Her chest ached, but she stood firm. Sundar observed her silently, admiring the way she faced fear without letting it consume her. Hours passed like slow-moving clouds. Mira sat in the waiting area, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Sundar remained beside her, offering nothing more than quiet company. Sometimes words weren't needed. Presence was enough. The clock ticked relentlessly, each minute heavier than the last. Around midnight, a sudden thought crossed Sundar's mind. He had built empires, made decisions worth billions, and stood on stages across the world, but nothing compared to sitting in that waiting room, feeling the weight of someone else's hope pressing on his heart. Finally, the doctor emerged. His expression softened as he approached. "The surgery was successful," he said gently. "He's stable now. The next few days are important, but for tonight you can breathe." Mira stood abruptly, tears spilling down her cheeks. Relief washed over her like a wave, breaking through weeks of fear. She covered her mouth, unable to speak. Sundar placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. Not as a stranger, not as a benefactor, but as a quiet witness to her struggle. She turned to him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "Everything happened so fast. I don't even know your name." Sundar hesitated. The moment he had avoided was finally here. He couldn't remain a shadow forever. He took a slow breath. "My name is Sundar," he said softly. She blinked, confused at first. Then her eyes widened. "SundarPichai?" she whispered in disbelief, her voice trembling. He nodded gently. "Yes." Her knees weakened, and she sat back down, staring at him as if the world had tilted. All this time, the quiet stranger who had stood up for her, protected her, and helped her father had been the man behind the company that owned the very restaurant where she worked. Why would you help someone like me?" she asked in a trembling voice. Sundar leaned forward, his expression calm but deeply sincere. "Because I was once someone like you," he said softly. "I know what it's like to face the world with nothing but hope. I built that restaurant not just to serve food, but to create opportunities, to support people who give their best even when life doesn't make it easy. When I saw you that night crying in the corner, I didn't see weakness. I saw someone strong who just needed someone to stand beside her for once." Her eyes filled again, but this time with something more than gratitude, something like faith. "No one's ever done that for me," she whispered. "You didn't just help me. You reminded me that kindness still exists." Sundar smiled faintly. "And now it's your turn to carry that forward," he said gently. "Your story doesn't end here. It begins here." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway. The man in the leather jacket appeared, his face tense. Sundar stood instantly, his posture calm but firm. The man stopped a few steps away, his eyes shifting between them. "I heard he's out of surgery," he muttered. "Good for you. But don't think I've forgotten." Mira stood tall now, her voice steady. "No, she said clearly. I haven't forgotten either. I'll pay you what I owe. But you won't threaten me again. The man scoffed, stepping closer, but Sundar's presence beside her was like a quiet force he couldn't ignore. Something in his gaze told the man that this was no ordinary situation anymore. Slowly, he backed away. Friday, he said one last time, then disappeared down the corridor. Mira exhaled shakily, but for the first time, she didn't feel helpless. She turned to Sundar. He won't stop, she said quietly. Sundar's eyes narrowed slightly. Then we'll deal with him properly, he replied. This time, not with fear. The following day, with Sundar's legal team quietly assisting in the background, the man's threats crumbled under the weight of formal action. The money she owed was paid properly and his intimidation was reported to the authorities. Mira was no longer alone in the fight. Weeks passed. Her father slowly recovered and she returned to work. But everything felt different now. The emergency grant program that Sundar had quietly established became permanent, helping other employees in need. Rakesh's attitude shifted too, now fully aware that every action was noticed by eyes far greater than he imagined. And Mira, once just a quiet server, found herself growing into a role she never expected. She began mentoring new hires, helping others the way someone had once helped her. One evening, as Sundar visited the restaurant again, this time without hiding, he watched her lead a team with quiet confidence. She caught his gaze from across the room and smiled, a real smile, full of light. Sundar nodded back, knowing that sometimes the greatest impact came not from grand gestures, but from choosing to show up in someone's darkest moment and refusing to leave. As the restaurant lights glowed softly against the night sky, it no longer felt like just a business. It felt like a living story of kindness, resilience, and unexpected connections. Sundar walked out into the cool night air with a quiet heart, knowing that what had begun as a secret visit had turned into something far more meaningful. A reminder that one act of compassion could change many lives, starting with one.